Well, hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to give you a spring tour of the garden. If you haven't been here before, my name's Jane and I'm an artist based right in the heart of beautiful Scotland. And I come here every Friday and I talk about creativity, or I talk about nature, or I talk about living life just a little bit differently. I have an autoimmune disease, which kind of means that I am fatigued a lot of the time. And a lot of what I'm talking about is really about wringing as much out of life as you possibly can. I've been intending to do this spring garden tour for quite a while, and in my head I kind of imagined that I would have the garden looking at its best. It would all be weeded and mulched, and all of the detritus that is often in the garden would be tidied away, and it would be just at its best. Now, last Friday, my dad fell over and he unfortunately fractured his hip. On Monday, he had it pinned back together again, and that all went really well. But clearly, he's so bored in hospital, and he's just desperate to have visitors all the time. So I want to see him. So suddenly, having this kind of big chunk of time in my week that I need to find, it makes decisions really, really easy, it turns out. So you have to get rid of some things. And one of the things that I have got rid of so that I can spend my time in a car driving to Edinburgh is the tidying up of the garden for this video. And I know, well, first of all, I know that you'll understand that, and that you are not judgy. You're not judgy people. But secondly, it actually occurs to me that given that I'm not a show garden, given that this is not, the National Trust or something that is just there to be seen by other people, it's actually, in many ways, much more interesting to see in its unprepared state. There's been no styling, no tidying up. This is the garden. And I think that is actually much more interesting, she says. We shall see, we shall see. But first, a little bit about the garden itself. Now, we moved here in 2003, August 2003, and we'd been looking for a small patch of land for quite a while. I had started a cut flower business, and the first year I just used my tiny garden to grow things. Hi, Doots. But by the second year, I needed more space. I had been lent some space on a friend's farm, but we were desperately looking for something with a bit of a garden. Now, this area, which is a farming area, it's really difficult to buy a house with a garden without it being just far too expensive. But this house came on the market, and it's a 1980s bungalow. It wasn't at all what I had in my mind. And it had been built with a bit of land by the farmer on one of these sort of planning permission things where he could get a permission to build a house if it was for a family member. So there were two houses built here for the farmer's sons. And then when the kind of legal tie that goes with that came off, they were sold on the open market. And there were other people living here, and they sold up and we bought it. Now, the land that we have here is 3 acres, but we have only ever grown in the top acre. It's a flat top acre, and then it slopes down into a valley. There's a boggy field, there's a little kind of alder wood that is carpeted with bluebells in a couple of weeks' time, and there is a burn called the Altgar Burn that flows through that. And we do nothing with that. It is part of what has become a sort of like a wildlife corridor along this valley, as none of the farms actually have livestock or anything down in this bit. So it's a really valuable natural resource that has come about really by chance. So the land is within the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, and in fact we are right on the boundary of it. And the reason for that is that during the Ice Age, Loch Lomond would have come up to kind of like the road in front of our house. That was the edge of the ice. And now Loch Lomond is 5 minutes drive away, so it just shows how big it was when it was under ice. But why that is relevant to a garden is that all of that ice dragged lots of different kinds of stones and silt and kinds of things, and then as it melted, dumped it here. So we have a really interesting mix of soils underneath here. So we arrived in, say, August 2003. At that time, my children were 3 and 5. And it was just amazing. It had been such a lovely summer. And it was scorching hot, and we sat on the lawn and we ate fish and chips, and there was house martins flying above us. But the garden at that time, it was a small piece of lawn, very beautifully kept lawn, a hazel tree, 3 leandy trees, and then lots of miniature conifers. We still have the hazel tree. Everything else we took out. But what is now the garden here was a kind of a pony paddock that was behind the main garden, behind the garden of the house. And it had been used to keep a horse in, it had been used to keep Highland cows in. It was just, you know, a blank piece of ground. So we came in, and I was just desperate to get started, because this was August. I wanted to be planting things out at the end of September, things like sweet peas, overwintered hardy annuals. I wanted to be able to get them all in by the end of September. And then I was wanting to get tulips in, once we get to November, and I had this great plans. So we really had to hit the ground running. And a friend of a friend said, oh, well, he would come, it'd be a half-hour job, to plough up the ground for me. And he would come and do that. So he arrived, and he had his tractor, and it had like one of these big things on the back, like a plough. And he started off, and it was fine for about the first 5 minutes. And then there was this terrible noise, and his plough, or whatever it is, just was mangled. I mean, it was in bits, and it was so embarrassing, because when somebody offers you a favour and then it goes wrong, you don't know what to do. And it had hit this enormous boulder, and it turned out that all over this ground there are patches where there's hardly any topsoil, and there are massive boulders underneath there. So he took it away to be mended, and I was kind of a bit, I don't know what to do here, because there's no way I could dig it by hand. It was just too stony, it was too difficult. And then just by luck, in the library here, actually, I came across Ruth Stout's book. Ruth Stout is an American gardener who started really the no-dig movement. She's much less known than she should be. And she was pretty much in the same position as I was. She wanted to start a garden really quickly. She wanted to be able to do it cheaply. She had minimal help and no heavy machinery. So she used great big mulches of straw and planted into that, and just basically covered up all the weeds and the grass and things. What we would now know as no-dig gardening, but she was well ahead of her time. So I got some very cheap spoiled straw. I put that out, and I got green compost. I got a truckload of rock dust, because green compost and rock dust go together really well. And we created raised beds. Only some of them were edged. Now we have everything is edged in the main garden, but time and money were not available then. But we made the decision to just build up the way. And that has been amazing for the garden, because it has turned something where there was very little soil in parts of it into something where it's got really good solid growing conditions. That's 20 years, but even from the start it was amazing. The other thing that we did pretty much immediately in the October was we planted hedges here. Now you'll see all over there are just these hedges, and they went in as tiny whips, and within 8 years they were looking like a good hedge. And now our job is really just keeping on top of them and making sure that they don't become 40 foot high. And I think that these hedges are the thing that has, along with the building the soil up, has made the biggest difference to the garden. And there are two reasons for that. One, they filter the wind. We're on the side of a hill. It's always slightly windy here. I'm actually now a little bit worried about this audio. And that is a wonderful thing, because it means that unlike most of our neighbours, we aren't overly troubled by midges, which, if you've ever been to Scotland in the summer and you've been somewhere where there are midges, it's not pleasant. But here, because midges can't fly in the wind, it has to be an unusually hot, still humid day for them to come in the garden. So there was, but I did want to filter the wind a bit for the plants, because they were all just getting blown out of the ground. So we planted the hedges, and that has made a big difference. But the second thing is that as soon as the hedges got over 6 foot tall, they began to fill with birds. And that has been amazing, because I do not have a great pest problem in my garden, because the hedges are full of birds. So last year, when everybody was having terrible trouble with slugs, I found that I really wasn't being overly bothered by them. Now, it's not the quality of my gardening. That has nothing to do with it, because when I was planting things down the local primary school, they all got eaten by slugs, but it is because of the birds. And seemingly, and I got this from a podcast that Adam Nicholson was talking on. Adam Nicholson has just published a book called Bird School, which is really good. But he's basically been looking at the garden birds at Perch Hill, which is his wife Sarah Raven's, well, I mean, it's his home as well, but you might know it because it is the garden where Sarah Raven, the gardening company and courses place and so on, is based. So he's been looking at garden birds, and they also had not had a problem with slugs. And his theory is that if you have blackbirds and thrushes, which we do, we have a lot of them, in the winter they eat seeds, but in the spring they eat protein. So they will be eating just like seed heads and things right the way through the spring. But as soon as they are trying to build themselves up, or they're going to be laying eggs, or they're feeding babies, they are looking for protein. And that protein is often slug eggs and small slugs. and so on. So the more blackbirds that you have that you do not feed, and I feed birds at the front of the house, but I don't feed them at the back. They just have to rely on all of the seed heads that I leave. So the more blackbirds and thrushes that you have in your garden eating natural seeds, they will then, you know, when those seeds are no longer there in the spring, they switch on to eating protein and they eat slug eggs. And that is just amazing, I think. So the hedges not only filter the wind, they also do a lot of my pest control. So the garden is now divided into 3 or 4 different bits. And the bit that I'm sitting in here is an orchard. And this was the part that we originally planted lots and lots of bulbs in. When we moved here, this was the bit that the plough had done before it broke. So I used it just to plant rows of alliums and narcissi and tulips and all of these kinds of things, because it was quick and it was easy. We built it up a bit, put lots of rock dust in, put some drainage in, like gravelly kind of drainage, and had rows and rows. It was very serried because what I was looking for was something that I could pick from quickly. Now, around about 2010, 11, I became very ill and I stopped the flower business. I've talked about this before. So what we did was we basically let this go back to grass. And we planted some plum trees, which are now, you know, towering over us here, and just left it. And what was interesting was that there was kind of like a ghosts of all of these bulbs came up through the grass, and it looked really, really weird. You know, you'd have grass and then suddenly a row of alliums, or whatever. So I decided to disguise that by planting more bulbs around the base of the trees and things. Lots of narcissi. I've planted Narcissi Thalia here, which is a beautiful white one that doesn't go soggy in the rain, which is quite useful here. And then lots of pheasant eye, because I love the scent of the pheasant eye narcissi, and it's just that they've got that little punchy bit of yellow in them. So I planted lots of those. I planted lots of snake's head fritillaries, and they started off, I would say, 3/4 purple and maybe 1/4 white. I probably bought them in those quantities. But pheasants come in the spring and they love snake's head fritillaries. But it turns out they only love the purple ones. They don't want the white ones at all. So now we have maybe 80% white snake's head fritillaries here and only 20% purple. And that's all been carefully selected by friendly pheasants from the field next door. But what I find now is that I have this very kind of vaguely naturalistic planting here, you know, if you will allow that white narcissi are in any way natural looking. But then I still have rows of alliums particularly, but also the odd pink tulip comes up. So I'm not quite sure how to get rid of them. We've tried mowing it. Behind me here, I think I've got the scent of chives, and it's not chives, it's an allium called allium hair, which I got 50 bulbs as an experiment in 2004, and it's now carpeted. An area of about, I don't know, 40 square metres here behind me, wafting up this chive scent. And this orchard is actually where we now have, this is the private space for people who come and rent our Airstream caravan. We have an Airstream caravan which is rented out through Airbnb and booking.com, and it's set up really for people to just come and chill. It's completely private space here because it's our sort of like personal garden is over the hedge, and my workshop is down via another path. And it's got an outdoor hot tub, and it's got a wood-fired sauna, and it's got all of this space. And you can sit out on the deck and look over the valley, and there are buzzards overhead, and there's all kinds of birds and animals, deer and hare, and it's a beautiful space. And that is what this orchard with its weird carpet of alliums that gets mowed is. And our personal garden is over the hedge. And this is a space that I have now turned into, I think, a productive garden. It looks beautiful. It has to look beautiful. It's what we look out from the house onto. It's where I walk through to get to my work. So it has to look beautiful. But the main point of it is also that it is productive. It has vegetables, but most importantly, it has the plants which I'm growing either for personal use in my art or to sell. And I sell them either as sort of like dye materials. I grow a lot of things like weld and sweet Sicily and purple pinkish and hoppy black black dye sunflowers. And I sell those, I dry them and then sell them as dye materials. I also dye a range of embroidery threads, and most recently I have been pressing the flowers from there in two separate collections. One for eco-printing, and they're things like coreopsis and tagetes, sulfur cosmos, the kind of things which work incredibly well for eco-printing. And then the other side are plants that work for things like cyanotypes and monoprinting. So things that have lots of complicated layers, like, what do you call it? Hedges pincushion, astrantia. A wonderful plant for doing cyanotypes because you get all of the layers and details coming through in that blue. So I'm pressing these and I'm putting them together as kind of herbarium sheets, I suppose, and selling them as little collections. And that's kind of like really small scale. And I can't sell them outside the UK because they're plant material. So the import, export, you know, way beyond me and way beyond the kind of numbers that I do. But this garden that's really its aim. It's a productive garden, but it is producing beauty. It is producing the means for people to create. Because lots of people, realistically, you know, they want to be able to create with natural materials and unusual natural materials, things that have a little bit of wildness around them, but they don't have access to somewhere that they could actually get those. They don't have a garden, or they don't have an allotment or whatever. I can grow things here and package them up. So all of these raised beds are going to be filled either with vegetables or they're going to be filled with plants and flowers. The main plants I grow outside for dyeing are scabious black knight, which is an amazing dark scabious which has so much dye in it. I grow black hollyhocks, which again you get these wonderful dark purples. I grow hoppy black sunflowers, which the seeds give this amazing dye. They have been bred over centuries by Native American people, and so it's gone from being like a straightforward sunflower to being one where it has an amazing amount of dye in the seeds. I grow rhubarb, and I do use the rhubarb root for dyeing. All these kinds of things are grown in these raised beds, and it is basically a return to my cut flower roots, but with a little bit of a twist, because there are not that many people. There are lots of people now grow cut flowers, and I am so delighted to see that. I don't think that there's anywhere in the UK that you wouldn't have some level of cut flower growing that you could access. But very few people are growing unusual varieties for eco-printing, printing down and making them available, because it's, you know, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. It's experimental. It's not clear how big the market is. It's certainly not as big as cut flower market, for example. But, you know, brings me an amazing amount of joy to see these flowers and to preserve them, and to be able to have other people access them and enjoy them. But, and this is a big but, I live in Scotland, and the climate in Scotland, in this part of Scotland, is quite wet and quite cold, and there are a lot of plants, although technically hardy here, they don't really flower very much. So I have a polytunnel, and the polytunnel was completely destroyed in the storms of February this year. Well, the cover came off and some of the wood snapped. So not completely. The hoops were fine. So since then, Ewan, my husband, has been repairing all of the side bits, and then some friends came along a couple of weekends ago, and we got the plastic back on it. And Ewan's now making doors and fitting the mesh around the bottom of it, because although plants need protection, they also need a lot of ventilation, the kind of things that I'm growing in here. And this is where I am growing a lot of my plants. So perennial plants, the madder is in here, and madder will survive outside-ish, but it doesn't actually increase. And then maybe every 4 or 5 years it will completely die off, which is not much use when you need a 4-year-old plant before you can harvest any of the roots. So last year I moved the madder into the tunnel, and it is doing so much better. You can see it's already sprouted and away, and having the tunnel gives us the temperatures of sort of halfway down England. So it changes the climate just enough for me to grow things. So I have the madder, and I have some coreopsis. Lots of different kinds of coreopsis, because although there is a Dyer's coreopsis, which is Coreopsis tinctoria, and I do grow that, there are also lots of other more ornamental, more frondy, more plants with movement, different colours, which work as printing plants exceptionally well. So I have all my coreopsis now in the tunnel, and that gives me about 6 weeks more flowers, and I'm estimating about 8 times the yield than when I have it out in the garden. So it's going to be the first year that I've had full coreopsis in here. That's going to be quite exciting, I think. Then I have sulphur cosmos in here. Again, it will technically survive outside, but it often doesn't flower. Whereas in the tunnel, a bit more heat, bit less rain, it starts flowering end of July, and crops and crops and crops and crops, and is rather amazing. And then I think I will try with a few other things just to see what the yield difference is. I will put some things outside, I'll put some things in the tunnel. Because the thing is that I'm never going to want to have several tunnels. That's not what I want my garden to look like. But given that I've got one polytunnel, I want to be using it to its maximum capabilities. So You'll see there are no tomatoes or anything like that in here. No tomatoes, no peppers, no aubergines, nothing. It's all just going to be dye plants, and we will buy our vegetables. So that's really a tour of the main gardens here. We have sort of like, we still have that little lawn that was here when we came. We've planted it up with plum trees and apple trees, and I love plums. My parents have plum trees, and just being able to pick plums when they're ripe, oh, just amazing. And I love plums. So we have planted a lot of plum trees, but the main birds that we have in this garden are chaffinches and bullfinches, both of whom feast on plum blossom and plum buds. So a lot of the time I get no plums at all. I think I'm now up to having 8 plum trees, and last year I got 3 plums from them because the blossom was all eaten. But you know, I live in hope. So these ones up by the house, I've just planted a couple of years ago. They have blossom on them now. I'm hoping that the bullfinches feel that these are a bit nearer the house and they don't just come and strip them in the way that they do the ones in the orchard. So that is my hope. And then here you see we've got like an eating bit and a table that Ewan made, and he's making a kitchen there, and there is the statutory. So I do hope that you've enjoyed the tour and that you have a wonderful, wonderful Easter break. And I'm now going to pack this up and head over to Edinburgh to see my dad. And I shall see you next week. Bye-bye.